Welcome to American Psychonaut, episode 2. We're bringing you psychedelic news, psychedelic culture, and psychedelic science. And this week, we're bringing you the psychedelic Dennis McKenna. He's a man whose name and reputation certainly precedes him in the world of psychedelics. He's a doctor of botanical sciences, a university lecturer, a researcher, an author, a renowned psychonaut, and I just learned this week that he is also a Colorado native. Dennis, what's up, man?
That's great to be here, Will. Well, lots of things are up. I think the aftermath of the psychedelic science conference, which was last week. Were you there?
I was indeed. I was kind of running around like a chicken with my head cut off to a certain extent, but
Likewise. I didn't even have a chance to see many presentations. I saw, I think, two presentations. I was just running around seeing people and making connections that way. So that's the way these things go. I mean, it was intense. It was a real zoo, but it was fantastic. I mean, in
it
that
was.
sense, it's great. I mean, 13,000 people, they told me.
It's
So that makes
absolutely
it the
crazy.
biggest psychedelic conference in world history,
Yeah,
which is, I guess that's a good thing. The world
I
is waking up to it.
it is. It does definitely seem to be. Yeah, I couldn't help but think while I was kind of wandering around the floor there, looking at all the booths that were like, companies that are growing mushrooms and selling growing kits and selling, you know, substrate blocks and that kind of thing. It had to have been kind of weird for you. Like you and Terrence literally wrote the book on how to grow psychedelic mushrooms at home. Seeing it come to this place where like now there's all these legal businesses growing around that had to be kind of crazy for you.
The fact is, growing these things is really pretty dead easy. And we had we just described a very simple method. And that put into the hands of many people the tools to do this. They could just go to the grocery store and buy the materials they needed. They had to get the spores, of course, someplace. But most people with a little persistence and patience could figure out how to do it. So, in that sense, the Magic Mushroom Growers Guide, was I think significant. It brought it into sort of a low tech space where any intelligent 10th grader could figure this out. And many of them did. I mean, literally intelligent, nerdy, science geeks in high school did many science projects based on this. And I think their parents maybe didn't look too closely at what was going on in the basement.
Well, it's
But
it's
some
wild that it's come from there, from like a book that you wrote, a pamphlet or whatever, a small guide, and now we have this huge psychedelic science conference where there's all these businesses that are built on the same model that you guys put forth like 50 years ago. That's pretty crazy.
it is rather amazing. Yeah, it's rather amazing. It's been around for a while, and yeah, it's gone well. It's interesting how certain of these psychedelics have kind of they've become global. They've ascended to a global stage. Mushrooms certainly, ayahuasca is another one, and of course we've had LSD around for years, and MDMA and those sorts of things. Interestingly, this morning I was out in my car. I was driving. I clicked into NPR, and there was a conversation about MDMA and the history of MDMA. So it's very much part of the cultural meme now. Everybody's talking about psychedelics.
Yeah, it seems that was something that conference kind of like seemed to embody to me. Was it seemed like all these different communities, like there were businessmen and there were scientists and there were hippies, all of them coming out of kind of the shadows and realizing like they were part of a much broader community. It definitely has come into the limelight.
Yeah, yeah. And interestingly, Colorado seems to be the epicenter of a lot of this change.
It
So
does.
I'm proud to say that I was born and raised, spent the first 17 years of my life in Colorado, and it wasn't like that back in the day. It was
Yeah.
something that we had to be very careful about, and I mean, like all people in that space at that time, but
Could you have
now
ever imagined
it's
living in
almost
Paonia?
respectable. Yeah.
Yeah. Could you have ever imagined living in Paonia back then that this was going to be like the epicenter of the decriminalization for these substances?
I never did. I never imagined it.
I was excited to learn that you grew up out there. That's one of the prettiest parts of the state, in my opinion.
Yeah, do you happen to know Paonia?
I do, yeah. I camp out there fairly frequently. It's beautiful.
Okay. Well, actually, I was just out there a couple of weeks before the conference, and there was a symposium in Aspen. Aspen, as you can imagine, is also another epicenter for psychedelics. There's now an Aspen Psychedelic Resource Center there, and they put on a very nice symposium. They kindly invited me to come and be the keynote speaker. And I have a soft spot in my heart for Aspen anyway, because it used to be a place that, well, in high school in Paonia, there wasn't a lot of cannabis around, but we knew that if we went over to Aspen and sort of, hung out in the right with the right people in the right places, and looked needy, some kind hippie would come up and offer to sell us some weed.
That's
And that was
awesome.
how we managed to score it.
I
So
mean,
uh,
that must have been back around the time Hunter Thompson was living there and running for sheriff.
Hunter Thompson was there. I never met the man, but yeah, he was there. He was there.
It's pretty wild, man. It's just I saw that on your wiki that you grew up in Paonia, and I got excited. I didn't realize you were a Colorado native, man.
Yep, it's true. And
Um,
both Paonia and Aspen are still pretty sweet places.
yeah, they're
At at a certain point, the hippies moved into Paonia and pretty much took over. It's even got its own strain of cannabis called Paonia Purple.
ooh,
And the hippies have really, or the countercultural people, the psychedelic people, have really upgraded the place. I mean, they moved in and opened organic restaurants and,
sure,
you know, organic farms, and they really made it a pretty nice place. I mean, before it was nice, but it was not progressive particularly. It was a
right, right,
coal mining town and fruit growing town,
yeah,
and we were certainly kind of in the underground at the time. And I mean, we both, well, Terrence left Paonia 2 years before he finished high school, but I remained there, and we were sort of, we were not flamboyant. We were not really. We were trying to keep a low profile, I guess,
sure,
because
yeah. Um,
the town was not open to this stuff at that time.
so as far as the legalization movement, it's huge and it's exciting and like the possibilities seem really endless. But is there anything about decriminalization that like makes you nervous or that you have reservations about?
Yeah, there are a few things. I think that as a community, we have to be careful about the co-optation and the pressure that this puts on natural psychedelics, with psilocybin. There's no problem because you can grow tons of psilocybin. It's not a supply issue. Something like ayahuasca or ibogaine
Hmm.
are, there's more pressure on that. Another one is peyote. There's a lot of concern about peyote, uh, because it's basically a threatened and endangered species.
Right.
And you can make the case that legalization will open something like that up to many more people. There just isn't enough, and the same with ayahuasca to a lesser degree. Ayahuasca can be grown, and it's very popular, as you know. But the solution there, in my opinion, comes out of forming alliances with indigenous communities in the Amazon to produce ayahuasca sustainably, and more or less to discourage people from going to South America to drink ayahuasca, bring the ayahuasca up to North America,
Yeah.
and bring the medicine to the people, not the people to the medicine, is what I've
Yes.
been saying lately. And
Yeah.
decriminalization opens up that possibility. What I would like to see happen is there are many centers in North America, Canada, and Europe that are already doing this, but they're underground or they're almost underground. Those centers should be allowed to operate freely and in the open, and that encourages responsibility. And if there's a local, like, call it alternative therapy center or something like that, that
Mm-hmm.
happens to offer uh, an option to take psychedelics, that's the right context to present these things in a lot of cases. Not so much in the clinical context. I think there is a place for that, for that kind of highly structured, uh, therapeutic context. But in most cases, something similar to the usual, ritual facilitated indigenous usage patterns, that works for most people. I mean, these things are usually a group experience anyway, and that's the way they're traditionally used. And so, why not? If these things are going to diffuse into society, we need to think about how we do that in a way that respects the medicine, respects the traditions of their use, and also encourages responsible use. And it all comes down to education, really. And so these holistic health centers, or whatever they are, could could be a perfect place for that, to educate people about them, and then to provide the medicines in a context that is appropriate, and uh, that effectively encourages people to approach it in a with a little common sense. And that's the way to do it, in my opinion. And then in rare cases or lesser cases, if someone has severe uh, mental problem, PTSD, or that sort of thing, it may make sense to do it in a clinical context. What I don't want to see is a situation where only the wealthy, only the elites have access to these medicines and these therapies, and everybody else is prohibited or prevented from doing it. That doesn't seem to be fair.
No, and that's it seems to, well, I wrote about this recently. There's a number of different scientists and organizations that seem to be kind of racing to develop non-hallucinogenic synthetic versions of psilocybin, ibogaine,
Right.
LSD, and sure, maybe that would open up access. The argument is that that would open up access. People could take these things home and put them in their medicine cabinet, and easily take a something that helps, like an antidepressant. But what are
Yeah.
your thoughts
But
on that?
but
Do you think?
where's the fun in that?
Right. Like what is
you
how
know,
important is the psychedelic part of psychedelics?
well, my own bias, my own belief is that this is a non starter. I think these people misunderstand what is going on. I think you need to have the psychedelic experience in order to get to the root of the problems that people take these for. It leads to a reorganization of neural architecture, connectivity, synaptogenesis, and all this.
Mhm.
But that arises from the the experience itself. I don't think you can split these things apart, and just have the molecule and say take the molecule that'll fix the receptors that will do all this stuff on the neurological level, and you really don't need to bother with a psychedelic experience. So I really disagree with that. I mean, this is basically saying the psychedelic experience is an undesirable adverse side effect of the
Right.
molecule.
Right.
I couldn't disagree more. I think that people take these to have access to meaningful experiences that change their lives. And if you just take it and maybe it changes your receptor ratios, changes a lot of things on the neurological level. But if you don't have the experience, what makes it any better than the psychopharmaceuticals that we already have? I mean, I just think I think this work is being undertaken, number one, probably by people who don't have never had a psychedelic experience and
Yes.
perhaps
Yeah.
don't appreciate the qualitative aspects of it. And then of course there's the profit motive. We can come up with a molecule that has this adverse effect engineered out of it, and we can sell it to a lot more people. And certainly the profit motive is, very much part of the psychedelic renaissance, or the psychedelic revival. I guess that capitalism and greed is part of the equation no matter what. And psychedelics don't cure you of that,
Right.
So, or maybe some people, but I think, I could, I just think this is a complete misunderstanding of what psychedelics are. If you, I mean, the word itself means mind manifesting, and so if you produce a molecule that does not manifest the mind, then by definition, it's not a psychedelic.
Kind of in that same vein, you kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, but I've been wondering and talking with people in the community about this idea that like as we're building this new frontier of medicine, there already exists a long, like thousands of years of tradition and ceremonial use of these substances.
Right.
And I kind of been wondering, like, as we develop the curriculum for psychedelic therapists and the certifications and the licensures, how much should, in your opinion, like, how much do you think we should be building from scratch? And how much should we be consulting these ancient traditions and appropriating some of their some of the traditions that they use to facilitate these things?
Right. Well, I think that cultural appropriation or co-optation is a concern, uh, but I also think that we have to acknowledge that, as you said, uh, you know, indigenous traditional cultures have been using these things for 10,000 years. They've learned a lot about how to use them, and this accumulated knowledge, I mean, one can say, well, it belongs to these cultures, and we shouldn't be stealing from it. That's one thing. But you can also say, well, these plants are the common cultural heritage of humanity. These really belong to earthlings, and everybody is indigenous to Earth. We're all indigenous people. I think that these plants should be thought of as a common, uh, almost co-evolutionary heritage of humanity. And uh, so we should learn from this accumulated knowledge. At the same time, we should acknowledge that we're not indigenous. We don't belong to indigenous cultures. We can borrow some of these practices and build on them. We have to develop a paradigm for the 21st century that takes the best of traditional knowledge and the best of contemporary psychotherapeutic or psychiatric knowledge, create a fusion of that, create something that is more than either one by itself. So a new paradigm. I think the psychedelic psychotherapists of the therapy of the future may resemble traditional practices more than it resembles uh, conventional psychotherapy. Conventional psychotherapy, for one thing, is usually a one on one kind of thing. It's the therapist and the patient, and it's sometimes it's a group situation. But I think that to make these experiences available to a wider number of people, group settings are probably the way to go.
Yeah.
You've probably been to some retreats and so on involving ayahuasca or other things. I've been to many, and I've organized some myself. That's another conversation. But what I have seen in my experience is the group dynamic that forms in a small group, ideally a small group, you know, the group dynamic that spontaneously emerges as people undergo these experiences and share their experiences is really an incredible thing. And it produces a therapeutic space, a therapeutic opportunity that would not that wouldn't happen if it were a one-on-one kind of thing. And then people come to these events, these retreats. They undergo the experience, they share their experience, and very often, at least in my experience, they form a community around that. They set up a WhatsApp group or whatever. People continue to keep in touch and support each other. I mean, this is a beautiful thing.
How long do you think human beings have been taking psychedelics?
Well, that nobody really knows. I am on the fringes. I'm on the extremes of this. I believe in the stoned ape theory.
Yeah.
I'm one of the promoters of it. I think it's probable, actually, that psychedelics, mushrooms, basically, have played a role in the coevolution back before there were Homo sapiens. I mean, you
Right.
could look at evolution. There have been several species, but I think it could be as far back as 2 million years, or
Yes.
even further, because what we know from different threads of information, we know that these hominid species were all co-evolving and interbreeding and all that together in northern Africa, and even mostly throughout Africa. But northern Africa is thought to, because that's where we find the fossil evidence. I think that we know it was at least 2 million years ago. The earliest hominids are that old from fossil evidence, and we know
Right.
that the brain tripled in size basically in a mere 2 million years. It's a long time, but where evolution is concerned, it's a very short time. It's the blink of an eye. we know that there were hominids evolving in this environment. We know from paleoclimatology that it was a much wetter, much warmer place. I mean, now Northern Africa is a desert. Back in those days, it was a savanna, but it was wet. It was a
It's very
much wetter
lush.
environment. And we know from fossil evidence that there were cattle, or the ancestors of the modern cattle were also in this environment. The hominids were hunting these things, they were eating them, they were getting, milk and clothing and all kinds of things from them. And the mushrooms grow out of the dung of the cattle, so you get this symbiotic triad. The mushrooms, the hominids, and the cattle. Uh, and It's a perfect environment. If you go to really any tropical ecosystem these days, you can see the same thing. I mean, any pasture in the tropics where there's cattle, if you look long enough and wait for the rains to come, it's going to happen.
Yeah,
You're going to find these things. So the Psilocybe cubensis specifically is the pan-tropical psilocybin mushroom. Certainly, I mean, certainly it was there. What we don't have is, I mean, mushrooms are not so good for fossil evidence. I mean,
right,
Cattle, you can find the fossil evidence. The hominids, you can find the fossils. Mushroom, not so much.
a little
They don't
harder.
leave fossils.
Yeah,
Uh, but it's a reasonable inference that given this environment and the climatic conditions that existed, which we know they existed back then, it's reasonable to think that mushrooms were found in that environment. And being primates, being number one, curious, number two, hungry most of the time,
right.
actively scavenging the environment for things to eat, surely they would have eaten these things. And I'm not
Yeah,
saying that, we ate mushrooms. Our ancestors ate mushrooms and just became smart. It didn't happen that quickly, but they had these, it had these effects. And what we know about neuroplasticity now and what this does to, you know, uh, uh, mushrooms stimulate neuroplasticity. They stimulate growth of neurons and formation of synaptic junctions and all of this. So they stimulate the complexification of the hominid brain, and the mechanism of epigenetics provides a way that this can actually be transmitted across generations. So all the pieces are in place, and of course you can't prove this, but you can't disprove it either.
that's
You
true.
know,
I
so
when I've brought this up with some other folks I've interviewed, the to play the devil's advocate for a moment,
sure.
they the argument that I always get is like, well, hold on a second. This time frame corresponds perfectly also with when we discovered fire and we were cooking our food and had all of this new caloric brain power that we could spend on bigger, more complicated thoughts, and that's what kind of pushed us to have bigger brains.
Well, I've
What do you
already answered that. In a sense, yes, this was going on, and the investigation, the controlled use of fire, goes back according to what evidence there is, and it's fairly sparse. But we know that the controlled use of fire, there are sites that are at least about 1.7 million years old. And yeah, these hominid groups, they knew the controlled use of fire. It put into their hands the ability to move from arboreal environments into savanna environments. And the
Mhm.
savanna environments is where these cattle and these mushrooms were. So it let them, and in fact, they used fire. if the history of, you know, in North America, for example, indigenous people would set prairie fires, and the idea was to drive these herds of bisons across, over cliffs into valleys, and then they could just harvest them at their leisure. This was probably going on back in the day in these environments that they were using. Yeah, they used fire to, uh, as a hunting tool, and then also because they could cook, and cooking, by the way, gives you the, uh, kind of the basic tools of pharmacology and chemistry. The
It
ability to
does.
make water extracts out of plants or whatever comes to hand. That may have come much later, but fire would played a part of it. I mean, fire, yeah, definitely had an effect. It had an important effect in that it expanded the range of these hominid groups and gave them this technology to cook, meat, and much better sources of protein that facilitated digestion. So, yeah, the people that say this, they have a point in the sense that, your energy could go toward thinking rather than chewing.
Right.
You spend
Yeah.
much less metabolic energy just digesting your food. You softened it up and it's more easily digested. So you had more time for, uh, less time for mastication and more time for, uh, contemplation, you might say.
Yeah, I like that. I like that a lot. I that's kind of where my thoughts have always been. Like, it's why couldn't both of those things have happened at the same time and both contributed to that
Yeah,
expansion
and
of.
it's not, it's not any one thing. I'm just saying that the mushrooms and the presence of the mushrooms was part of a complex mix. Another
Yeah.
thing, for example, was, uh, there have been studies that show that, psilocybin increases visual acuity. At fairly low doses, it increases visual acuity. So
Hmm.
if you're a hunter with a spear, trying to, bring these cattle-like ancestors down, that's got a facility. It basically it made people better hunters.
That makes perfect
Some
sense.
folks have said, one criticism that's been leveled at this idea is, basically that if people are stoned all the time, you know, they can't deal with their environment. A lot of times, the high doses of mushrooms, it doesn't put you exactly in a position to, closely monitor your environment, right? Because you're loaded, you're not paying attention. On the other hand, lower levels of these things puts you into a hyper vigilant place where things in the environment, you're much more aware of them. I
Yeah.
mean, you're aware. If you, for example, even today, if you take, say, psilocybin or ayahuasca or something like that, even though we're not indigenous people and we're certainly not hunters, but we can take psilocybin and go into nature. And if you just go into nature and sit quietly in that state, the background comes forward. I've often said this, that brings the background forward. You notice processes going on in nature that normally are suppressed, because they don't have immediate survival value. I mean, you need to have your attention focused on the saber-toothed tiger that's about to eat you. But if you do it in a controlled situation where, for the moment you don't have to worry about saber-toothed tigers, you could take it, and you are become much more sensitized to processes in the environment that are normally that we don't pay attention to.
Yeah,
So I
that
think that's part of the picture as well.
that all makes perfect sense to me, and
Of
I am
course it
I am
does.
a firm advocate for the stoned ape theory. I think you guys really are onto something there because I it just seems like in my mind mushrooms had to be the first like mind altering substance we really started using as a species, like brewing things,
Sure,
smoking
because
things.
you don't need tools. That's the other
Yes.
thing about mushrooms. Something like, all you have to do is have curiosity, and the curiosity to bend over and pick this thing which appears out of nowhere and take it. No technology involved. That's the thing. Something like ayahuasca, and the mushrooms are, particularly psilocybe cubensis, they're big and they're noticeable. Some psilocybin mushrooms, lots of mushrooms are kind of hard to find. They're tiny. You really have to be looking for them. But psilocybe cubensis just kind of smacks you right in the face, and
Yeah.
they get to be big. They're golden and they're noticeable. And so I think this was part of it. This was a big part of what was going on. Something like ayahuasca or any of these plant-based medicines, if it requires making extracts and so on, yeah, they could figure out how to do that, but that was probably several million or hundreds of thousands of years in the future, where they actually started, you know, practicing what amounts to primitive chemistry. Make water extracts and throw stuff in there and see what happens.
Yeah.
Uh, Mushrooms don't require any technology. This is one of the things. All you have to do is pick it and eat it and wait and see what happens.
Okay. Fast forward 2 million years. Um, the last time you and I talked, it was 2018, and you were just getting ready to um, launch or announce or get started the McKenna Institute.
McKenna
Um,
Academy.
McKenna Academy, pardon me, pardon
Right.
me. Um, Go ahead and tell us about the McKenna Academy and what's been going on in the last 5 years for you guys.
Okay. Well, yes, we incorporated the McKenna Academy in 2019. Originally in Canada, I moved to Canada in 2019, so we incorporated here. And then, for various reasons, we decided it made more sense to uh, base it in the States. So even though I live here, we incorporated in California as a 501c3 nonprofit. So we're registered with the IRS as a nonprofit educational and scientific organization, which means, for one thing, people that want to support us, they can get tax deductions from that. And our people are all over the world anyway. I live in Canada. Many of our people live, we have people, board members, and so on, living in Europe, in the States, in South America and other places. So we're kind of we're we don't have an actual building or campus. We're just a virtual outfit. But since then, so we incorporated in 2019. We did a retreat in Peru in November 2019, and then COVID hit, and
Of course.
that rearranged a lot of our priorities. The idea was that we were going to do many retreats, and that just came off the table for about 3 years. So we had to pivot and develop an online presence, which we have done. We did a number of online events uh, in 2020 and 2021, 2022. Uh, Probably the most significant that we've done was last year. We did this conference called ESPD 55, which was the 55th anniversary of the Ethnopharmacologic Search for Psychoactive Drugs, uh,
Ah, okay.
which is what ESPD stands for. And the original ESPD conference was sponsored by the National Institute of Mental Health in 1967, and and it was a landmark conference, except that it was a private conference. No taxpayer got to go to it. What the taxpayer got from this was the book that came out of it, the proceedings of the symposium, and that book came into my hands at the age of 18 in 1968. And that was my inspiration to study ethnopharmacology because I realized there was a scientific background to this. You know, it was chemistry,
Yeah.
pharmacology, botany, all of those things, anthropology. Well, the government was supposed to have follow up conferences of this every 10 years or so. But in 1970, the war on drugs came along. The government became, kind of embarrassed that they'd even had anything to do with this, even though a lot of the
Mm,
main, investigators of the time, like Schultes and Shulgin, these people were all at this conference, but they never had a follow up conference. So
right.
in 2017, I decided to do a follow up. Everything fell into place, funding, venue, all of that. So I did ESPD 50. And we did it in the UK. And that was a fantastic conference. And we published a book. We actually republished the original 67 book because it was public domain, right? Taxpayers paid for it. So we
Yeah,
published it.
sure.
We published the 2017 symposium together as a box set, which you can still order from Synergetic Press. And then 5 years later, we decided to do ESPD 55, which we did, and people can look at the McKenna Academy website and look at both conferences. If you go to www.mckenna.academy and you look at the menu, there's a menu tab for ESPD. You can go there. You can look at the 2017 conference and the 2022 conference. You can register at either one of these. You can register at espd55.com, and we'll steal your email, but that's all. We won't take any money. It's completely open. There's a lot of good stuff there. There's incredible presentations there. You can watch them, and there's a book coming out. We've just finalized the symposium uh, volume for ESPD 55, and that'll be published either later this year or more likely next spring. But that will be
Okay.
available, and Synergetic Press is the one that's publishing it. They're great print. They're a great outfit, by the way. They handled all of the book sales for the MAPS conference, so they're on track to be the premier, uh, psychedelic publisher in the world, or at least in North America. And incidentally, just shameless self promotion here. The
Please.
My memoir, which came out in 2012, before when I was just a freelancer, there was none of this academy or any of that. But Synergetic just published a second edition, a 10th anniversary edition of my memoir, The Brotherhood of the Screaming Abyss, and that's available too. And it's the old one. It's the 2012 edition plus an additional chapter, or afterward, actually, an additional 50 or so pages looking back on the last 20 years since basically the first edition kind of ended in 2000. But this looks back on the 20 years, 23 years since then.
I was on the ESPD 55 site last night, and I was listening to
Oh,
Paul Stamets' presentation on the stoned ape theory. So I was really glad you brought that up.
yes, all the presentations are there, and the whole idea of the ethnopharmacologic search is that we want to look into the obscure sort of nooks and crannies of this space. You know, there's a
Hmm.
lot of psychoactive drugs that nobody knows anything about. For example, the presentations that Shaheen
Yeah, yeah, I
Enterman
saw
on
that
the
in there.
Zoroastrian psychedelics. Pretty
Hmm.
cool stuff, actually. So people can buy that, or they will be able to buy that, but you can look at everything on the espd55.com site.
Yeah, I'm kind of a voracious podcast listener, and so when you shared that with me, it was like I've got talks to listen to for the next week and a half.
Yep, yep.
It's
And
perfect.
please feel free to share it.
It's been a real pleasure. It's been an absolute pleasure, man. I hope we get to talk again in the not too distant future here, and I get to catch up on some of the other stuff you're doing.
Absolutely. Yeah. Anytime. I'm looking forward to the next one.
Sounds good. All right, Dennis. Hey, take care, man.
Okay, you too. Bye bye. Bye bye.